Woman gave her only bed to a scarred Apache warrior. Weeks later, their camp filled her field. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. In the heart of the harsh and unforgiving American West, a lone woman lived in a small cabin nestled by the edge of a vast and open plain. Her name was Sarah, and she had learned to survive the endless solitude. The world around her was vast and silent, with only the wind and the occasional animal for company. Life had not been kind to her, and she had long since grown used to the quiet isolation. But that all changed the day she encountered a man who was not only a stranger, but a wounded Apache warrior. It had started like any other evening. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm orange glow over the endless fields when Sarah first saw him. He was barely conscious, slumped against a tree by the creek that ran through her property. His clothes were torn, and his body was covered in deep, gruesome scars, each one telling a story of battles fought and survived. Sarah had been out gathering firewood when she stumbled upon him. At first, she hesitated. A wounded warrior, a member of a people who had been at odds with settlers like her for years. What could she possibly do? But something in his condition moved her. He looked vulnerable, not like the fierce warrior she had heard stories about, but a man broken, desperate, and alone. She didn't know who he was, but she knew one thing. He needed help. Without thinking twice, Sarah rushed to his side. She tore off strips of her worn shirt and used them to bind his wounds. She carried him back to her cabin, careful not to aggravate his injuries further. It was a difficult task, but somehow she managed. Sarah's small cabin, which had always felt so empty, now seemed to shrink as she carefully laid the man on her only bed. She had only one bed, one pillow, and one blanket, but she made him as comfortable as she could. She wasn't sure if he would survive the night, but she knew she had done all she could. The next morning, Sarah was still unsure of what would happen. The man had not stirred, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. She had no way of knowing if he would wake or if he would succumb to his wounds. But she didn't leave his side. She stayed with him, tending to his needs, giving him water when he could drink, and sitting quietly by his side, waiting. As the days passed, Sarah grew increasingly worried. She had no way of knowing how long it would take for him to heal, or if he would ever leave her cabin. But she remained committed to him, determined to care for him no matter the cost. And then, on the 5th day, he woke. His eyes opened slowly, locking with hers for the first time. There was a mixture of gratitude and confusion in his gaze, but he could not speak. It was clear that the wounds he had sustained in battle had not only scarred his body, but also his spirit. Sarah had given him the only bed she owned. And now, in return, she would get the answer to a question she hadn't even asked herself yet. What would happen next? She could never have anticipated what would come weeks later, when the peaceful solitude of her cabin was interrupted by the arrival of something she couldn't have imagined, a scene that would forever change the course of her life. As the days passed, Sarah found herself growing more comfortable with the presence of the Apache warrior. He had become a silent companion in her otherwise lonely life, resting in the bed she had given him. Slowly, his wounds began to heal, but the silence between them grew thicker. She had taken to watching over him, offering him water, and providing him with whatever food she had. He had never spoken much, only muttering a few words when he was first conscious. But Sarah could tell he was struggling with his own demons. The scars on his body were more than just marks of battle. They seemed to tell a story of a life, filled with pain, loss, and hardship. Sarah could understand that. She had her own scars, though not visible. The pain of solitude and the absence of family haunted her just as much as any wound could. One morning, a change came. The warrior was sitting on the edge of the bed when Sarah entered the room with some food. He looked up at her, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something Sarah couldn't quite place. He was ready to speak. She could feel it. He opened his mouth, hesitating at first, as if the words were foreign to him. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice rough. "I am alive because of you." Sarah smiled softly, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "You don't need to thank me," she replied gently, setting the food down beside him. "I did what anyone would have done." The warrior shook his head, his expression serious. "No, not everyone would have done this. Not many would have cared for a stranger, especially one like me." Sarah paused, looking at him. "You're not just a stranger," she said quietly. He looked at her for a long moment before looking down at his hands, as if lost in thought. Sarah didn't push him. She understood that some things needed time. Weeks went by, and the warrior's presence became a part of Sarah's life. One evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows over the fields, Sarah noticed something strange on the horizon. A large group of riders, moving toward her cabin. Her heart skipped a beat. The warriors that had arrived so unexpectedly. Were they coming for the man she had helped? Was this some sort of retaliation? Her thoughts raced as she stepped outside, trying to make sense of the situation. As the riders drew closer, she could see that they weren't hostile. They moved with a purposeful grace, and their leader, a tall man with a stern face, was clearly in charge. When they reached her cabin, they stopped and dismounted. Sarah could feel the weight of the moment, her nerves on edge. But there was no hostility, only a quiet reverence. The warrior she had helped, the one who had been laying in her bed just weeks before, now stood beside her. He looked different, more powerful, more certain of himself. He stepped forward, his voice clear as he addressed the leader of the riders. "I owe her my life," he said, his words strong. "And so does my tribe." The leader of the riders nodded. "We come to honor her," he said, his voice deep and respectful. Sarah's heart raced as she realized what was happening. This was not a threat, it was a sign of gratitude. The warriors who had come to her field were not there to cause harm, but to give thanks for the kindness she had shown one of their own. The leader stepped forward and handed Sarah a small, intricately carved pendant. "This is a gift," he said, "from my people. We honor those who show kindness in a world that often forgets." Sarah held the pendant in her hand, feeling its weight. She couldn't believe what was happening. These men, who had once been seen as enemies, were now offering their respect. The warrior she had helped stood beside her, a silent witness to the transformation that was taking place. As the days passed, Sarah's fields began to fill with life. The warriors of the Apache tribe returned, bringing with them food, supplies, and the promise of protection. Sarah's once lonely life had been changed forever, not through any grand gesture, but through the simple act of kindness she had shown to a man in need. And as the warriors continued to come, Sarah realized that her small, humble actions had created a ripple that reached far beyond her understanding. What had started as an act of compassion had now become a bond, one that had the power to bring together two worlds that had once been at odds. The weeks passed, and Sarah's life began to change in ways she could never have imagined. The warriors who had arrived in her fields had become more than just visitors. They had become part of her life. Each day brought more of them, bringing food, building shelters, and offering her protection. The small cabin that had once been a symbol of her solitude had transformed into the heart of a thriving community. What began as one man's survival had blossomed into a bond between two worlds. Sarah was no longer alone. She could feel the weight of their gratitude, and with it, a sense of purpose she had never known before. The man she had helped, the Apache warrior who had slept in her bed, stood by her side as a friend and protector. He had become a constant presence, his silent strength a comfort to her. They spoke little, but there was an understanding between them, a bond forged in the quiet moments of care and shared experience. Yet, despite the warmth of their growing connection, Sarah still felt the weight of the world outside their peaceful refuge. The surrounding land had always been unforgiving, and she knew that trouble was never far off. One afternoon, as the sun began to set and the last light of day bathed the land in a soft, golden glow, Sarah sat on the porch, watching the horizon. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hooves, distant, but growing nearer. She stood up, her heart racing. She recognized the sound. It was not the familiar rhythm of the Apache riders who had come to help her, but something different, something more menacing. The warriors in her camp had always moved with purpose, but these riders came with an urgency that set her on edge. As the riders crested the hill, Sarah could see that they were not Apache. They were white men, dressed in worn-out uniforms. Their faces were grim, their eyes cold. The leader, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, raised his hand, signaling the others to stop. Sarah's stomach tightened. She had heard stories of men like them, raiders, soldiers, and settlers who had fought for control of the land, taking what they wanted without a second thought. The leader dismounted and approached her cabin with deliberate steps. Sarah's hand instinctively went to the door, but she stayed where she was. There was no point in running. They had already found her. The man stopped a few feet away, his eyes scanning the fields. "We've been looking for you," he said, his voice low and rough. "This land belongs to us, and you've been harboring Apache." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The warriors who had come to her were no longer just visitors. They were family. They had helped her in ways she could never repay, and now this man was threatening everything she had built. She stood tall, her eyes meeting his. "This land belongs to no one but those who respect it," she said, her voice steady. "I've done no wrong." The man sneered. "You're protecting them, giving them food, shelter, making them stronger. This is a crime against the law." Sarah's mind raced. She knew what these men were capable of, but she also knew that she could not let them tear apart the peace she had found. Just then, the Apache warrior who had been by her side stepped forward, his presence commanding. The tension in the air was palpable. The leader of the riders looked at him, his eyes narrowing. "You," he said, his voice filled with contempt. "You're the one she's been hiding." The Apache warrior stood firm, his gaze unwavering. "I owe her my life," he said simply, his voice calm but powerful. The leader scoffed. "You'll regret that," he muttered, turning to his men. But before they could take another step, a loud voice rang out. "Enough!" It was the voice of the Apache chief, the man who had led the warriors to Sarah's door weeks earlier. He had arrived just in time, his warriors surrounding the riders. The leader of the white men froze, his face pale as he realized the situation was no longer in his control. "You're trespassing," the Apache chief said, his voice deep and full of authority. "This land is under our protection. Leave now, and we will not follow." The riders hesitated, their eyes darting nervously. The leader of the group glared at Sarah, then at the warriors who now stood in a protective circle around her. "This isn't over," he spat, but he knew better than to push any further. Without another word, he signaled to his men, and they retreated, leaving Sarah and the Apache warriors in the fading light. As the riders disappeared over the horizon, Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. The chief approached her, his expression softening. "You are safe now," he said. Sarah nodded, her heart still racing. The bond between her and the Apache warriors had been tested, but it had held strong. She knew that from this moment on, she would never be alone again. The days following the confrontation with the riders were filled with a quiet sense of relief, but Sarah knew that this peace could not last forever. The Apache warriors who had come to protect her remained in the area, but life had taken on a different rhythm. There was a deep sense of connection now, not just between Sarah and the warrior who had been saved, but with the tribe as a whole. She could feel the weight of their gratitude in everything they did for her. They worked the land alongside her, growing crops, repairing fences, and building structures that would ensure her safety for years to come. But Sarah knew there were still questions that needed answering, and the presence of the tribe only deepened her curiosity. One afternoon, as she stood by the edge of the field, watching the wind stir the tall grasses, the warrior who had once been a stranger to her approached. He stood silently beside her for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon, before speaking. "The chief wants to speak with you," he said. Sarah nodded, her heart quickening. She had not yet spoken to the Apache chief in any depth since his arrival, and she knew that this was more than just a simple conversation. The chief had been a figure of authority, but also one of respect. She felt both a sense of admiration and nervous anticipation. When they reached the gathering place, a fire was already burning, and the chief, along with a few of his trusted warriors, sat waiting for her. They made space for her by the fire, their faces calm but expectant. Sarah sat down, her hands clasped in her lap. The chief looked at her with steady eyes. "You have helped us," he began, his voice deep and strong, "and we honor you for it. But there is more to be done." Sarah glanced at the warriors beside him, their eyes trained on her. "What more can I do?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. The chief nodded slightly, as if anticipating her response. "You have shown kindness to one of our own, And because of that, you have gained something much greater than just our gratitude. You have gained our trust." He paused, his gaze shifting to the horizon, as if contemplating something beyond their immediate surroundings. "We have been pushed to the edges of this land, and it is only by standing together that we can survive." Sarah understood the weight of his words. The struggles of the Apache people had been well known, and she knew that they had long been marginalized, forced to fight for their land and their way of life. But what she had not realized was how much her small act of kindness had meant to them. She had given something precious, a bed, her only bed, to a stranger, and in return, they had given her more than she could have ever imagined. "What do you want me to do?" she asked again, this time with a sense of urgency. The chief turned back to her, his eyes narrowing. "We need your help to keep this land safe," he said, his voice steady. "There are others who would take it from us, just as they have taken from us before. We have fought for this land for generations, but we cannot do it alone." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She had never imagined that her small farm, her quiet life, would be part of something so much larger. She had no experience with fighting or war, but she understood the gravity of the chief's words. This was her home now, and these people, the Apache warriors who had once been enemies, had become something far more important to her. They had become her family. The chief leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking with hers. "You have seen what they are capable of. You have seen the way they treat us. You are in a position to help us, and we ask that you stand with us." Sarah felt the weight of his request, and something inside her stirred. This was not just a call to action. It was a call to honor the trust they had placed in her. The bond she had forged with this tribe was not just about survival. It was about standing together, against all odds. "I will help," she said, her voice steady. The chief nodded, as if he had been waiting for that response. "Good," he said, rising to his feet. "We will need your strength, your courage. And we will need you to speak for us, to those who do not understand what it means to stand for something greater than oneself." Sarah felt a fire ignite within her. She had found her purpose, and it was tied to these people, to this land. As the warriors gathered around the fire, preparing for the challenges ahead, Sarah knew that this was just the beginning. The bond between her and the Apache tribe was unbreakable, and together, they would face whatever lay ahead. As the weeks passed, Sarah became more involved with the Apache tribe and the growing sense of unity that had taken root in her life. She had made a decision to stand by them, and each day, her connection to the land and its people deepened. The warriors continued to help her with the farm, working together to bring in the harvest, mend fences, and fortify the land. But despite the peaceful atmosphere, Sarah could feel that something was brewing on the horizon. The chief had been cautious, watching for signs of trouble. It wasn't just the white settlers who were a threat. There were other tribes, and even larger forces, looking to control the land that had once been theirs. One morning, Sarah awoke to find the camp unusually quiet. The warriors had gathered by the fire, speaking in hushed tones, their faces grim. She knew something was wrong. As she approached, the chief motioned for her to join him. "There are signs," he said quietly. "Signs that others are coming. We must prepare." Sarah's heart sank. She had known that peace would not last forever, but the reality of it was far different from what she had imagined. The thought of facing another battle, of defending her new life, was both terrifying and empowering. The Apache warriors had already proven their strength and loyalty, but Sarah wasn't sure if she had the courage to stand with them when the time came. The chief seemed to sense her uncertainty. "You have proven your worth to us," he said. "You stand with us, not because of blood or past, but because of your heart. You have shown us that one act of kindness can change everything. But the time for kindness may be over." Sarah nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She understood. The peaceful life she had hoped to build had come at a cost. There would be no more hiding. They would have to fight for what they had. Over the next few days, preparations for the upcoming confrontation grew more intense. The Apache warriors practiced their drills, sharpening their weapons, and Sarah found herself increasingly drawn into their world. She learned to move with purpose, to stand strong and fight for the land she had come to love. She wasn't a warrior by nature, but she had something far stronger, resolve. The day of reckoning came sooner than expected. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the land when the distant rumble of horses reached Sarah's ears. The warriors immediately fell into formation, their faces set in stone, ready for whatever lay ahead. Sarah stood by the fire, her hands trembling, but she held her ground. The warriors had made her one of their own, and it was time to prove that she deserved their trust. The first wave of riders appeared on the horizon, a large group moving with purpose. Sarah could see the dust rising behind them, but it wasn't until they were much closer that she realized the riders were not Apache. They were settlers, armed and ready for battle. The leader, a man she had seen before, rode at the front. His face was filled with anger, his eyes dark with hatred. "This land is not yours," he shouted as he approached. "We'll take it back, no matter the cost." The chief stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "This land belongs to those who respect it. You have no place here." The settlers stopped, their horses restless, and a tense silence settled over the field. The air was thick with the weight of the moment. Sarah stood beside the chief, her heart racing, but she didn't move. She knew what was at stake. The leader of the settlers sneered. "You think you can stand against us? We've got the law on our side. We'll burn this place to the ground if we have to." Sarah took a deep breath, then stepped forward. "You don't have the law on your side," she said, her voice steady. "You have only violence and greed. This land has been ours long before you arrived, and it will stay ours." The leader's eyes widened with surprise, and for a moment, there was silence. The chief nodded in approval. The settlers had underestimated her. They had expected fear, submission. But Sarah had learned something important over the past few weeks. Kindness could bring people together, but it was courage and unity that could drive them forward. "Leave now," the chief said, his voice rising with authority, "and never return." The settlers hesitated, their leader's anger rising, but there was no backing down now. With a final glare, the leader turned his horse and rode off, the rest of the group following behind him. The warriors let out a collective breath, and Sarah exhaled, feeling the tension leave her body. They had won. But as she looked around at the warriors, their faces serious, she knew this was only the beginning. The Apache had stood their ground, and so had she. Together, they had proven that a single act of kindness could build something strong enough to withstand anything. The chief turned to Sarah, a rare smile crossing his face. "You have proven yourself," he said. "Not just to us, but to the land itself." Sarah felt a rush of pride, knowing that she had not only found a new family, but also the courage to stand with them. The battle was over, for now, but she understood that the fight for their home would never truly end. The victory against the settlers was a brief reprieve, but Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before others would come. The Apache warriors who had fought beside her now seemed more like family, and their bond had grown stronger with each passing day. Despite the peace that had settled over the land, an uneasy tension lingered in the air. The days that followed were filled with preparations, not just for defense, but for a new way of life. One where Sarah was no longer an outsider, but an integral part of the tribe's survival. The Apache warriors continued to tend to her fields and protect her farm, but Sarah had taken it upon herself to learn more. She spent her days with the women of the tribe, learning their ways, their skills, and their traditions. She became familiar with their language, their customs, and the stories that had been passed down through generations. Each night, she sat by the fire with the warriors, listening to the tales of battle, survival, and the deep connection the Apache had to the land. The chief, once a figure of authority, had become a mentor to Sarah. He had seen the quiet strength in her, the same strength that had led her to offer her bed to a wounded warrior months before. And he had come to trust her, not just as a woman of the land, but as someone who could help lead the tribe in times of need. One evening, as Sarah walked through the fields, she heard the distant sound of drums. The noise was steady, rhythmic, and powerful. It was a call to the warriors, a signal that something was coming. Sarah's heart raced as she rushed toward the camp. She found the chief standing with his warriors, his expression unreadable. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. The chief turned to her, his face calm but stern. "We have received word from another tribe. They are coming, and they do not come in peace." Sarah's blood ran cold. She had heard stories of tribal conflicts, of skirmishes over territory, but she never thought it would reach her. The chief continued, "They seek to claim this land, to take what is ours." The Apache warriors began to prepare, gathering their weapons and readying themselves for whatever was to come. Sarah watched them, her mind racing. This was it, the moment when everything would be tested. She had chosen to stand with the Apache, and now she had to prove that her place among them was not just by chance. As the night wore on, Sarah joined the warriors by the fire, her hands trembling as she prepared herself for the battle ahead. She had learned much, but she was still unsure of herself. Would she be able to fight alongside them, or would she freeze when faced with danger? The chief approached her, his eyes steady. "You are one of us now," he said, his voice low. "When the time comes, you will stand with us." Sarah nodded, her heart heavy. She had never wanted this, never wanted to be caught in the middle of a conflict. But now, there was no turning back. The next day, the tribe scouts brought word that the enemy tribe was nearing. The Apache warriors began to move swiftly, positioning themselves around the land, preparing for the inevitable clash. Sarah stood with the women, watching as the warriors rode out, their faces set in determination. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her, but there was no fear, only resolve. As the enemy tribe arrived, the air was thick with tension. The two groups met at the edge of the land, their faces hard, their eyes filled with defiance. The chief stepped forward, his voice clear and commanding. "This land belongs to us," he said, "and we will not surrender it." The enemy leader, a tall man with dark eyes, sneered at him. "Your people are weak," he spat. "This land is ours by right." The words hung in the air, heavy with the promise of conflict. Sarah could see the warriors around her tense, their hands tightening on their weapons. But she also saw something else, something that gave her hope. The Apache were not just fighting for land. They were fighting for their way of life, for the land that had sustained them for generations. And Sarah, despite her fears, knew she had made the right choice. She had chosen this land, these people, and now she would stand with them. The battle that followed was fierce. Arrows flew, weapons clashed, and the sounds of war filled the air. But Sarah did not falter. She fought alongside the women, protecting the vulnerable and ensuring that the warriors had what they needed. It wasn't the violence of battle that gave her strength. It was the unity of the Apache, the way they fought as one. The tide of the battle turned quickly in their favor. The enemy tribe, outnumbered and overwhelmed, began to retreat. Sarah stood by the chief, watching as the warriors pressed forward, driving the invaders back. The fight was over, and the Apache had won. The chief turned to Sarah, a rare smile crossing his face. "You stood with us," he said. "And for that, we are grateful." Sarah felt a wave of pride wash over her. She had proven herself, not just to the tribe, but to herself. The bond between her and the Apache had grown stronger in the heat of battle. She was no longer just a woman on the sidelines. She was part of something greater. The land, the tribe, and the people she had come to love were hers to protect. And she would do so for as long as it took. The victory over the enemy tribe marked a turning point, but Sarah knew that the peace they had fought for would always be fragile. The Apache warriors had proven their strength, but they also knew that threats would never be far away. The tribe continued to live and work together, their bond stronger than ever, but there was an underlying tension that Sarah couldn't ignore. As the days passed, she noticed changes in the tribe. The warriors, once vibrant with pride, seemed to carry the weight of an unspoken burden. The chief, ever stoic, grew quieter, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Sarah could feel the restlessness in the air. One evening as the sun dipped below the mountains, Sarah found herself alone by the creek, thinking. She had come a long way from the woman who had offered her bed to a wounded Apache warrior. Now, she was part of something larger, something that required more than just strength. It required wisdom and understanding. As she sat by the water, her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. She turned to see the chief approaching, his expression as unreadable as ever. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Sarah nodded, not sure how to express the unease she had been feeling. "There's something on your mind," the chief continued, his eyes locking with hers. "Tell me what you feel." Sarah hesitated for a moment. She had never been good at voicing her doubts, but now, with the chief standing before her, she felt she needed to speak. "I feel like there's something coming," she said, her voice low. "Something that we're not ready for." The chief studied her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. "You're right," he said finally. There is something we are not prepared for. The settlers will return, and they will bring more with them. We have to be ready. Sarah's heart sank. She had known the peace they had fought for wouldn't last, but hearing the chief confirm it made her feel the weight of the coming storm even more. What can we do? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The chief didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned toward the horizon, his face hardening. We must be strategic, he said. We have the land, but we need more than just warriors. We need alliances. We need to reach out to the other tribes. Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. The Apache had fought for generations to protect their land, but now, they needed more than just strength, they needed unity. I'll do whatever it takes, she said firmly. The chief looked at her, his expression softening slightly. You have proven yourself, Sarah. You have earned our respect. But now, we need you to help us gather allies. The land must be protected. Sarah felt a sense of determination rise within her. She had never imagined herself in a position of leadership, but the chief's words gave her the courage she needed. She had found her place among the Apache, and she would do everything in her power to protect them. Over the next few weeks, Sarah traveled with the warriors, meeting with leaders from neighboring tribes, offering them the alliance of the Apache. She spoke passionately about the need for unity, for standing together in the face of the growing threat from the settlers. Some tribes were hesitant, their trust not easily earned, but Sarah's persistence and the Apache warriors' respect for her helped bridge the gap. Slowly, the alliances began to form. The Apache, once a single tribe fighting for survival, were now united with others. Together, they were stronger. As Sarah returned to the Apache camp, she felt a sense of pride. The chief had been right. They were stronger together, and their unity would be their greatest weapon. But even with their newfound allies, Sarah knew that the battle ahead would be unlike any they had faced before. The settlers would not give up easily, and the coming confrontation would be one of the greatest challenges the Apache had ever faced. The warriors continued to train, their movements more focused, their resolve unbreakable. The women of the tribe worked alongside them, preparing food and supplies for the coming conflict. And Sarah? She stood with the chief, her heart heavy but filled with determination. They had united the tribes. Now, they would face the future together. It wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for their way of life, for their land, and for the future of the Apache people. Sarah had found her place, not just as an ally, but as a leader among them. And she would stand strong, no matter what came next. The days leading up to the final confrontation felt like a storm gathering on the horizon. The Apache, now united with their allies, stood ready, but the air was thick with anticipation. Sarah had never seen the warriors so focused, so determined. They were not just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for their home, their land, and their future. The camp had transformed into a place of strength and preparation. Every warrior had a purpose, every task was vital, and even the women and children played their part, ensuring that the camp was fortified and ready for what was to come. Sarah had taken her place among the warriors, not as a passive observer, but as an active participant. She had learned to fight, to move with the warriors, and to protect the land she had come to love. She wasn't a trained fighter, but she had something just as valuable, a fierce determination to stand beside the people who had welcomed her, to protect the future they had worked so hard to build. As the days passed, the Apache scouts reported that the settlers were preparing for their final push. The enemy had gathered their forces, bringing in reinforcements from other settlements, and it was clear that they intended to take the land by force. But the Apache had something the settlers didn't: unity. The chief, now a man of great respect not just among his own people but among the allied tribes as well, had devised a plan. They would strike when the settlers least expected it, using the land to their advantage. The Apache had long known how to use the terrain to their benefit, and now, with their combined strength, they would make sure the settlers couldn't take what wasn't theirs. On the eve of the battle, Sarah stood outside the camp, looking at the land that had become her home. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, and she felt a deep connection to the earth beneath her feet. She knew that whatever happened tomorrow, they would fight with everything they had. The chief approached her, his face calm, but his eyes filled with resolve. "You've become one of us, Sarah," he said quietly, his voice steady. "Tomorrow, we fight together." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm ready," she said, her voice firm. She had come so far since the days when she had first offered her bed to a wounded warrior. Now, she was part of something much larger, something that would not only change her life, but the lives of all those who stood with her. The night before the battle, the warriors gathered around the fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. There was a quiet intensity in the air, but there was also a sense of unity, of belonging. The chief spoke to them, his words ringing with the weight of history and hope. "This is our land. This is our future. We will stand together, as one, and we will not let anyone take it from us." The warriors nodded in agreement, their eyes reflecting the same fierce determination. The women of the tribe stood nearby, their hands steady as they prepared supplies for the warriors. Sarah joined them, her heart heavy but her mind clear. She had become more than just an ally to the Apache. She had become a part of their story. The morning of the battle arrived, and Sarah stood alongside the warriors, her heart racing as she looked at the approaching settlers. They were ready. Every warrior, every woman, and every child had a role to play. The battle that unfolded was swift and brutal. The Apache, using their knowledge of the land and their unity, struck with precision. The settlers, unprepared for such a coordinated attack, faltered quickly. The sound of arrows slicing through the air, the clash of weapons, and the cries of battle filled the air, but Sarah stood firm. She fought alongside the warriors, her movements determined, her resolve unwavering. As the battle raged on, Sarah's thoughts were clear. She was not just fighting for survival. She was fighting for the land she had come to love, for the people who had become her family. The battle lasted hours, but when it was over, the Apache had emerged victorious. The settlers, defeated and scattered, retreated, leaving the land in the hands of those who had fought for it. As the dust settled and the warriors stood victorious, Sarah felt a wave of exhaustion and relief wash over her. The future was uncertain, but in this moment, they had won. The chief approached her, his expression solemn but filled with respect. "You fought well, Sarah," he said, his voice low. "You have proven that you are not just a part of this land, but a protector of it." Sarah nodded, her heart swelling with pride. The Apache had stood together, and they had won. But Sarah knew that this victory was not the end, it was just the beginning. The land they had fought for was now theirs, and together, they would ensure it stayed that way. The days after the battle were filled with both relief and reflection. The Apache tribe, now united with their allies, had successfully defended their land, and Sarah had played a pivotal role in their victory. The settlers had been driven back, but Sarah knew that the fight was not over. The peace they had fought for could not be taken for granted. Life in the camp gradually returned to a new normal. The warriors, though weary from the battle, continued their work on the land, while Sarah worked beside them, tending to the crops and ensuring that the tribe's needs were met. The women of the tribe helped her with everything, from cooking to weaving, and Sarah had learned more about their way of life than she could have ever imagined. The chief, still a guiding force in the tribe, continued to provide counsel to the people, and Sarah had grown to respect him even more. She had seen the wisdom in his eyes, the strength in his leadership, and the unwavering commitment to the land and the people. One evening, as Sarah sat by the fire, the chief approached her. His face was soft but serious, and his eyes held a depth that Sarah had come to recognize. "You have earned our trust," he said, his voice deep and steady. "You are not just an ally, Sarah. You are one of us." The words meant more to Sarah than she could express. When she had first arrived in this land, she had been a stranger, an outsider. But now, she was a part of something much larger, a family that extended beyond bloodlines, united by shared struggles and triumphs. She had found a place where she truly belonged. "I have learned so much from you all," Sarah replied, her voice filled with emotion. "This land, this tribe, it has become my home." The chief nodded, a look of approval on his face. "You have done more than just learn," he said. "You have helped shape the future of our people. Together, we will protect this land, and we will build a future for our children." Sarah felt the weight of his words. The responsibility they carried was immense, but it was a responsibility she was ready to shoulder. The following weeks were filled with new challenges, but Sarah faced them with courage. The Apache people were not only survivors, they were resilient, and together with their allies, they began to rebuild. They planted new crops, strengthened their defenses, and worked together to ensure that the land they had fought so hard to protect would thrive for generations to come. Sarah, now an integral part of the tribe, continued to learn and grow, not just as a woman, but as a leader. She helped mediate discussions between the tribes, ensuring that the unity they had forged remained unbroken. The bonds of trust were strong, and as the seasons passed, Sarah could see the fruits of their labor. The land, once a battleground, was now a symbol of strength and unity. The Apache, with their allies, had created something that could not be taken away. As Sarah stood on the edge of the camp, watching the sun set behind the mountains, she felt a sense of peace. The journey had been long, and the road ahead would not always be easy. But she knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The Apache had stood strong, and now, with their unity and determination, they were ready to build a future that honored the land and their way of life. Sarah had found her place, and she was no longer just a part of the tribe's story. She was part of its future. The future of the Apache people, their land, and the bonds they had created would endure, and Sarah would be there, standing with them every step of the way.